Money can buy almost anything: jets, empires, second chances. But as frost crept across my windshield like skeletal fingers, I understood its limit. It couldn't buy oxygen. My name is Elena Vance, once untouchable in tech, now just a woman freezing inside a $200,000 coffin of glass and steel. The silence in the Tesla was suffocating, thick as the snow burying it outside. It smelled of leather and expensive perfume, absurd luxuries in the presence of death. At 4:12 p.m., I had been arguing over profits, untouchable and feared. Now I was shaking, reduced to instinct, trapped in a storm that didn't care who I was. The heater gave its last breath, and the cold slipped in like a patient predator. My phone blinked at 1% battery, no signal, no help, no hope. Outside, the world had vanished into screaming white chaos. The shortcut I trusted had become a grave, and I was its first occupant. Numbness crawled up my legs, and sleep tempted me like a soft lie. Then a thud against the car jolted me back from the edge. A man emerged from the storm, wrapped in ice and silence. He tapped the glass, his eyes sharp and unreadable through the frost. "Come with me or die here," he said calmly, like it was a simple choice. My phone died, and with it, my hesitation. The trek was agony, each step dragging me deeper into exhaustion. He didn't comfort me, he just pulled, relentless, like survival itself. The cabin was crude, barely standing, but it blocked the storm. Inside, a little girl smiled at me like I was something magical. Elias worked without warmth, efficient and distant. He gave me hot water, more valuable in that moment than anything I owned. The room spoke of struggle-bare shelves, worn blankets, quiet desperation. Lily's pale face lingered in my mind, fragile as the flickering fire. As night settled, I noticed his workbench precise, deliberate movements. Curiosity pulled me closer, back into the world I understood. Under a tarp lay equipment I recognized instantly: advanced, expensive, mine. This wasn't survival gear, this was something calculated. I wouldn't do that, Elias warned, suddenly behind me. His voice carried something colder than the storm outside. I saw the gun at his side, and the truth began to form. This wasn't coincidence, I hadn't been found. "You should have stayed in the car," he said quietly. "It would have been easier for you." Then he turned over a photograph. It was me, marked with a red X. The storm howled louder, but I barely heard it. I hadn't been rescued or had been chosen. I forced myself to breathe, to think past the fear tightening my chest. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely holding together. Elias studied me like I was a problem already solved. "Because people like you never face consequences?" he said flatly. Lily shifted near the fire, watching us in silence. Something in her expression felt wrong, not fear, not innocence. "You built systems that erased lives with a keystroke," he continued. "My wife worked for your company until your optimization buried her." The word hit me harder than the cold ever could. "Layoffs, restructuring, numbers on a report I never questioned. She died waiting for treatment we couldn't afford," he said. "And now you're here, finally within reach." I swallowed hard, forcing control back into my voice. "Killing me won't bring her back." "No," he replied, steady and hollow. "But it restores balance." The fire cracked between us, the only sound in the room. Then Lily coughed, a sharp, painful sound that broke the tension. Elias turned instantly, all his hardness collapsing into concern. He rushed to her, kneeling, checking her temperature with shaking hands. "She's sick," I said quietly, piecing it together. The pale skin, the supplies, the isolation, it all clicked. "Don't," he snapped, not looking at me. But I was already moving, instinct sharper than fear. "I know systems," I said, steady now, "and I know how to get you help, real help." He froze, torn between rage and desperation. "Hope is a dangerous thing when you've buried it." "You're lying," he said, but his voice cracked. "Because part of them needed it to be true." "I can connect you to doctors, resources, everything," I pressed. "But you have to let me live." Silent, stretched, fragile and heavy. The storm outside began to ease, as if the world was holding its breath. Lily looked at him, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "Daddy!" "I don't feel good." That was the moment everything shifted. Not power, not revenge, just a father and a choice. Elias closed his eyes, the gun lowering slowly. For the first time he looked uncertain, Fix this, he said hoarsely. And you walk out of here, I nodded, already planning, already calculating. Because survival, real survival, was something money alone could never buy. Survival is a funny thing. One moment you're grateful for the person who pulled you from the wreckage, and the next you're wondering if you should have just let the cold take you. Because as I sat in that cramped cabin, I realized Elias didn't find me by accident. He wasn't a savior, he was a hunter. The air in the cabin had changed. The warmth from the wood stove, which only minutes ago felt like a miracle, now felt stifling, like the heavy, stagnant air of a tomb. I stared at the photograph on the workbench, my own face, crossed out in red ink, and felt a coldness in my chest that no fire could touch. I looked at the gun tucked into Elias's waistband. I looked at the high-tech signal jammers, then I looked at him. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had already died once and was simply walking through the motions of a ghost. "Who are you?" I whispered, my back pressed against the rough, splintering logs of the cabin wall. Elias didn't answer immediately. He picked up a rag and began to wipe a smudge of grease from the workbench, his movements slow and methodical. The silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic hump-hump of the wind outside and the soft, shallow breathing of the little girl, Lily, sleeping just a few feet away. "You really don't remember, do you?" Elias finally said. He turned to face me, the firelight casting a harsh line down the center of his face, splitting it into gold and shadow. "To you, I was just a line item, a decimal point that didn't align with the quarterly growth. I was employee ID 8842. The memory hit me then, sharp and jagged. Vance Global, 3 years ago. The Azure Project. It was our most ambitious endeavor, a global encryption network designed to protect high-level government data, but it had been plagued by leaks. The lead developer, I breathed, the realization taste testing like copper in my mouth. Elias Thorne. Thorne, he repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Back then I thought hard work meant something. I thought loyalty was a two-way street. I gave 10 years to your father, Elena. I practically lived in those labs. I spent more time with your servers than I did with my own wife. He stepped closer, and I instinctively flinched. He noticed, and his eyes darkened. Don't worry, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. I'm not a monster. If I wanted you dead, I would have left you in that Tesla. The Cold is a much cleaner executioner than I'll ever be. He walked over to a stack of firewood and kicked aside a piece of loose floorboard. From beneath it, he pulled out a thick blue folder. He tossed it onto the table in front of me. The Vance Global logo stared up at me, mocking and corporate. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of photos. Some were from my public appearances, the galas, the ribbon cuttings, but others were private. Me walking my dog in the park, me sitting at a sidewalk cafe, me standing by my mother's grave on the anniversary of her death. You've been following me, I said, a wave of nausea rolling through me. I've been studying you, Elias corrected. I needed to know if the woman who signed my termination papers felt anything. I needed to know if you ever looked back at the wreckage you left behind. Elias, the Azure project was failing, I said, my CEO instincts kicking in, trying to find a logical exit. There were security breaches. The board demanded a total overhaul. I was told you were responsible for the vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities? Elias roared, his voice finally breaking the calm. Lily stirred in her sleep, whimpering, and he instantly lowered his volume, though the intensity remained. I found the vulnerabilities, Elena. I went to your office. I told you that the backdoors were being installed by the contractors you hired, the ones with the political connections. I told you the system was leaking private citizen data to the highest bidder. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine. I could smell the wood smoke and the sharp tang of old coffee on his breath. And do you know what you did? You didn't investigate. You didn't fix the leak. You fired me for gross negligence. You blacklisted me so thoroughly that no tech firm in the country would even look at my resume. You turned me into a pariah. I was told you were the one selling the data, I whispered. And you believed them because it was easier, he spat. It kept the stock price high. It kept your Iron Queen crown polished. He turned away, pacing the small room like a caged animal. While you were celebrating your IPO, my life was disintegrating. My wife, Sarah, she had a heart condition, congenital. We had the best insurance in the world while I was at Vance. The week after you fired me, the coverage ended. No other company would hire me because of the negligence flag on my record. We lost the house, we lost everything. He stopped and looked at Lily. Sarah died in a state-run ward because I couldn't afford the private surgery she needed. She died alone because I was out trying to find a job washing dishes just to keep the lights on. And then Lily started showing the same symptoms. The weight of his words felt like a physical pressure on my lungs. I looked at Lily, the small, pale girl huddled under the mismatched blankets. She wasn't just a child in a cabin. She was the living consequence of a decision I had made in a boardroom 3,000 miles away. Is that why we're here? I asked. Is this about revenge? Revenge is a luxury for people with time, Elias said. He walked over to the workbench and pulled back the tarp I had seen earlier. The screen flickered to life. It was a high-resolution interface glowing with a deep obsidian blue. On it was a complex map of a digital architecture I knew all too well. It was the Vance Global Central Treasury. I don't want your life, Elena, Elias said, his eyes fixed on the screen. I want your access. I've spent 2 years building a bypass, but your new biometric security is flawless. It requires a retinal scan and a voice-authorized phrase that changes every hour. Only 3 people have the key, you, your coup, and the chairman. And since you were kind enough to take the hidden pass during a blizzard, you want me to rob my own company, I said, the gravity of the situation finally settling in. I want the money that was supposed to be my pension, Elias said. I want the $50 million your board saved by cutting my department. That money is going to take Lily to a specialist in Zurich. It's going to buy her the life you took from her mother. Suddenly, a harsh, wet sound filled the room. Lily had woken up, but she wasn't crying. She was coughing, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake her entire small frame. Elias was at her side in an instant. He lifted her up, rubbing her back as she gasped for air. Her face went from pale to a terrifying shade of blue-gray. "Daddy," she wheezed, her eyes rolling back slightly. "It hurts, it's so cold." "I know, baby, I know," Elias whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that made him look completely different from the man with the gun. He reached for a small nebulizer on the shelf, but when he clicked it, it only hissed a dry, empty sound. "It's empty," he gasped, his eyes darting around the room in a panic. "The refill. The storm blocked the delivery. I was supposed to get it yesterday." He looked at me, and for a second, the hunter was gone. There was only a father, drowning in his own helplessness. "Help her," he pleaded, his voice breaking. I stood up, my own fear momentarily forgotten. I had seen this before, my mother's lungs filling with fluid in her final days. "She needs to be upright," I said, moving toward them, "and we need steam. Do you have any more water?" "The stove is low on wood," Elias said, his hands shaking as he held his daughter. "Then use the table," I yelled. "Break the furniture. We need heat, Elias, now." For the next hour, the cabin was a blur of desperate movement. Elias smashed a wooden chair and fed it into the stove while I held Lily, rubbing her tiny hands, trying to keep her conscious. I told her stories not about business or tech, but about the stars and the ocean. I watched Elias, this man who hated me, as he watched his daughter fight for every breath. As the steam from the boiling pot filled the small area behind the curtain, Lily's breathing finally leveled out. She drifted back into a fitful sleep, her hand clutching the hem of my expensive cashmere sweater. Elias sat on the floor, his head in his hands. The fire was dying again, and the cabin was slipping back into a chill. "She's dying, isn't she?" I asked softly. Elias looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "The doctor said she has 6 months. That was 4 months ago. The surgery in Zurich is the only thing. It's the only chance." He stood up, his face hardening again, the wall of his resolve slamming back into place. He walked to the workbench and turned the monitor toward me. "The transfer window for the Vance Global Treasury opens at midnight. That's in 2 hours," he said, his voice flat and final. "You're going to log in. You're going to authorize the life-extending grant to an offshore account I've set up." "And if I refuse?" I asked. Elias looked at the gun on the table, then at his sleeping daughter. "If you refuse," he said, Then you're telling me that your money is worth more than her life. And if that's the case, Elena, then I have nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in this storm. He reached out and grabbed a headset, throwing it onto the table. Get ready, he said. In 2 hours, you're going to prove to me who you really are. Part 2 cliffhanger. I looked at the screen, then at the gun, and finally at the little girl who was the only innocent thing in this room. My hand moved toward the keyboard, but as I touched the keys, a red alert began to flash on the monitor. A secondary window popped up, a GPS tracker. Elias, I whispered, my heart skipping a beat, look. The tracker showed a fleet of black SUVs moving slowly, but steadily up the hidden pass, less than 5 miles away. They weren't rescue. They were the Vance Global private security team, my own cleaners, and they weren't coming to save me. They were coming to make sure the Iron Queen and her secrets stayed buried in the snow forever. Elias gripped the gun, his eyes locking onto mine. Did you call them? No, I gasped. They tracked my phone before it died, Elias, if they find us here. They won't leave witnesses? Not me, and definitely not you. We both froze as the sound of a distant, low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a heavy-duty engine. They were already at the base of the ridge. The man who saved my life was now holding it hostage. But as I looked at the dying little girl in his arms, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. I wasn't sure if he was the villain of this story ... or if I was. The hum of the engines grew louder, a predatory vibration that seemed to rattle the very marrow in my bones. On the monitor, those red dots, my own security team, were crawling up the topography of the mountain like digital parasites. They're early, Elias hissed, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The blizzard should have kept them at the base for at least another 3 hours. How did they get through? The armored Sherpas, I whispered, the realization hitting me with a cold dread. Vance Global invested in heavy tread rescue vehicles last year. They don't need a road. They don't even need a path. They just need a coordinate. Elias turned to me, his face a mask of betrayal. The gun was back in his hand, though it trembled. You signaled them. Some kind of hidden distress code on the login screen? If I wanted them here, would I be standing here trembling? My board of directors? They don't want me rescued. They want me replaced? The truth was a bitter pill I had been swallowing for months. There had been whispers of a coup move by the CFO to declare me unfit, due to the very stresses the Azure project had caused. If I died in a tragic accident in the Rockies, the company would move on. The secrets of the data leaks would die with me, and the insurance payout would be astronomical. To my company, I was worth more as a martyr than a CEO. They're not coming for a rescue, I continued, my voice steadying. They're coming for a cleanup. And they won't leave a disgruntled ex-employee and a witness child behind to tell the story. Elias looked at Lily, who was fitfully dreaming under the pile of blankets. The anger in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a frantic, primal fear. He wasn't a soldier. He was a father and a mathematician. He was out of his league, and he knew it. The transfer, he said, his voice cracking. We have to finish it. If I have the money, I can buy a way out. I can disappear. There's no time to disappear, I countered. We need to move. Now, with her? Elias gestured to Lily. In this, she frees in 10 minutes. I looked around the shack. It was a tinderbox. One well-placed incendiary round from a security team, and this place would be a funeral pyre. My mind, trained for years to find the pivot in a failing business deal, began to scan the environment for assets. The equipment, I said, pointing to the signal jammers. Can you widen the radius? If you can kill their GPS and their comms, they'll be blind in this whiteout. They're following a last known ping from my phone. If we move that ping, we move the target. Elias's eyes lit up, the engineer returning to the front lines. I can loop the signal. I can make it look like the phone is moving toward the old mining camp 3 miles east, but I need the laptop to stay powered, and the battery is at 12%. Then do it fast. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in desperate ingenuity. Elias rewired the jammers, his hands moving with a grace that made me realize just how much my company had lost when we let him go. I gathered whatever supplies I could, a tin of crackers, a flask of lukewarm water, and every blanket in the house. I looked at Lily. She opened her eyes, her pupils dilated and hazy. Is it time to go, Daddy? Yes, baby, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt beside her. We're going on a little adventure, just like the stories, okay? You have to stay very, very quiet. He wrapped her in his own heavy canvas jacket, leaving himself in nothing but a thin flannel shirt. I started to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a reflex. We stepped out into the night. The wind had reached a fever pitch, a physical weight that tried to shove us back into the cabin. The snow was no longer falling. It was a horizontal sheet of ice that stung any exposed skin. Elias carried Lily against his chest, shielding her with his body, while I lugged the laptop and the battery pack, tethered by a short cable. We moved uphill, away from the road, toward a jagged outcropping of rock Elias knew about. Every step was an agony of exertion. My designer boots, meant for walking from a limo to a lobby, were useless. I fell, my shins slamming into hidden rocks, the cold so intense it felt like fire. Keep moving! Elias shouted over the gale. We reached the bunker, a natural cave reinforced with old timber from the mining days. It was small, damp, and smelled of wet earth, but it was hidden from the thermal imaging of a helicopter. Elias set Lily down in a corner, piling the blankets around her. He snatched the laptop from me, checking the signal. The loop is active. They're turning, see? On the screen, the red dots had deviated from the cabin's coordinates. They were heading toward the cliffside to the east. For a moment, we breathed. The silence in the cave was thick, broken only by the whistling wind and the digital hum of the laptop. Why? Elias asked suddenly. He was leaning against the cold stone wall, his chest heaving. Why help me? You could have run when we were outside. You could have screamed for them. I looked at my hands. They were covered in grease and dirt, the manicured nails broken. Because for the first time in 10 years, I'm not looking at a spreadsheet, Elias. I'm looking at a person. I spent so long building Vance Global that I forgot I was supposed to be building a world worth living in. I looked at Lily. She looked so small, a tiny spark of life in a vast frozen wilderness. I didn't know about Sarah. I didn't know the board had blocked your insurance. I should have checked. I was the CEO. The buck was supposed to stop with me. Elias looked away, his jaw tight. It's easy to be sorry when you're in a cave. It's harder when you're in a penthouse. I know, I said, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But if we get out of this, I won't let her end up like Sarah. I promise you that. The moment was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't an engine. It was the sound of the mountain itself. A deep, subsonic vibration that made the dust shake from the cave ceiling. Elias froze. He scrambled to the mouth of the cave, peering out into the white. The wind, he whispered. It stopped. He was right. The screaming gale had dropped to a dead hush. And in the mountains, a sudden silence in the middle of a blizzard only meant one thing. The snow on the upper ridges had reached its breaking point. The cleanup team's heavy vehicles, with their massive weight and vibrating engines, had done what nature couldn't. Avalanche, Elias breathed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't grab the laptop or the $50 million sitting on the screen. He dove across the cave, throwing himself over Lily. Get down, he screamed at me. I threw myself flat against the dirt just as the world exploded. It didn't sound like snow. It sounded like a freight train made of iron bars slamming into the mountain. The mouth of the cave vanished instantly as a wall of white pulverized the timbers. The air was sucked out of the room, replaced by a pressure so intense my ears popped painfully. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was under. When I finally forced my eyes open, my mouth was filled with grit. There was no light, none. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that exists only in deep space or deep graves. Elias, I croaked. My voice was a dry rasp, nothing. Elias, Lily. I tried to move, but my legs were pinned. A heavy timber had fallen across my thighs. The pain hadn't started yet, that was the terrifying part. It just felt like my lower half didn't exist. I clawed at the dirt, my fingers hitting something cold and metallic. The laptop. I fumbled for the power button. It shouldn't have worked. It had been slammed into a stone wall. But as I pressed it, the screen flickered a dim, cracked blue light that felt like the sun. I swung the light around the small enclosed space. The cave had collapsed, leaving only a tiny pocket of air about 5 feet wide. And there, 3 feet away, was Elias. He was partially buried, his legs disappearing into a mass of snow and rock. He was slumped forward, his forehead resting on the ground, but his arms were still locked in a protective circle around a bundle of blankets. I dragged myself forward, ignoring the screaming protest of my hips. I reached him, my hands shaking. I pulled back the blanket. Lily's eyes were open. She was staring at me, her face smeared with dust, but she was breathing. She was alive. "Elias," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He didn't move. I turned his head toward the blue light of the laptop. A jagged piece of wood was protruding from his shoulder, and blood dark, almost black in the blue light, was soaking through his flannel shirt. "Elias, wake up, please, I can't do this alone." His eyes cracked open, unfocused and glazed with shock. He looked at me, then down at Lily. A weak, wet smile touched his lips. She's okay? She's okay," I sobbed. "But the cave is buried." "Elias, we're trapped." He looked at the laptop screen. It was still showing the treasury transfer. 100% complete. Success. $50 million sat in a digital account. A king's ransom. In the middle of the frozen tomb, it was the most useless thing in the universe. "The radio," Elias whispered, his voice fading. "In my bag. I have an emergency beacon, but it has to be at the surface. The snow ... it's too thick to signal through." I looked up. The ceiling of our little pocket was a chaotic mess of snow and broken timber. We were at least 10 feet underground. "I'll dig," I said, my voice cracking. "I'll get us out." "Elena," Elias said, reaching out a blood-stained hand to grip my wrist. His grip was weak, the iron gone. "Look at the oxygen sensor on the laptop." I looked. The laptop's internal diagnostics were showing a red warning, CO2 levels rising. In this tiny, sealed pocket with 3 people breathing, we didn't have hours. We had minutes. Part 3 cliffhanger. I looked at the narrow chimney of snow above us, the only possible way to the surface. It was too small for a man. It was even too small for me, but it was just wide enough for a child. "You have to send her," Elias whispered, his eyes closing as the blood loss took hold. "But she doesn't know the way. And the security team, if they're still out there, ... I looked at the $50 million on the screen, then at the dying man, and finally at the little girl who held the only key to our survival. I had to make a choice. I could use the last of the laptop's battery to try and signal for help, or I could use it to give Lily the light she needed to climb, but there wasn't enough power for both. And as a heavy, metallic thud echoed from somewhere above us, I realized the security team wasn't gone. They were digging, and they weren't looking for survivors. In the end, the money didn't matter. The lawsuit didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the heat of a heartbeat in the middle of a frozen tomb. I had spent my life building empires, but in that moment I would have traded it all for a single match. The blue light from the cracked laptop screen flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls of our icy grave. The air was growing thick, sweet, and heavy with the carbon dioxide of our own breath. Every inhale felt like trying to drink through a clogged straw. I looked at Elias. His face was a ghastly shade of marble in the digital glow, the blood from his shoulder wound sluggishly staining the snow beneath him. He was fading. And Lily, she was looking at me with eyes that were too large for her face, filled with a terrifying, silent trust. "Elena," Elias wheezed, his fingers twitching toward the laptop. "The battery." 4%. Above us, the heavy thud clank of metal on ice echoed through the darkness. My own security team men I had hired for their cold efficiency were digging, but they weren't calling out my name. They weren't sounding sirens. They were moving with the grim, quiet intent of a demolition crew. If they found us, they wouldn't see a rescued CEO. They would see a liability that needed to be erased to protect the company's stock price. I looked at the narrow chimney of snow where the timber had cracked. It was a slender throat of white leading to the surface, barely 8 inches wide. "Lily," I whispered, pulling her close. Her small body was trembling, but she didn't cry. "I need you to be a mountain climber. Do you see that light up there? That tiny bit of gray?" She looked up. A pinprick of moonlight filtered through the packed snow. It's too high, Elena. No, it's not. I'm going to lift you. You're going to crawl up, and when you get to the top, you're going to take this. I reached into Elias's open bag and pulled out the emergency beacon. It was a small orange cylinder. You just pull this tab? Can you do that for me? What about Daddy? She asked, her voice small and trembling. I looked at Elias. He met my eyes, and in that moment, 3 years of corporate warfare and personal tragedy evaporated. There was only a father's love. He nodded once, a jagged, painful movement. Daddy is going to rest for a minute. I lied, my heart breaking. We're right behind you. I used the last of my strength to hoist her up. My legs screamed in agony. The timber was still pinning me, crushing the circulation, but the adrenaline of a cornered animal took over. I shoved her into the narrow crevice. Climb, Lily. Don't look back. I watched her tiny boots disappear into the darkness. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in decades that the snow wouldn't shift. Then the laptop screen hissed and went black. Total darkness. The silence that followed was worse than the avalanche. It was the silence of a vacuum. I sat there in the pitch black, my hand finding Elisa's cold, calloused one. We sat in the dark, two enemies bound by a dying child's hope. You really authorized it? Elias whispered into the dark. Yes, I said. The 50 million, it's in the account, even if I don't make it out. The lawyers will find it. I set up a secondary trigger. It goes to a trust for her if my heartbeat sensor flatlines. I felt his grip tighten slightly. I spent so long hating you, Elena. I thought you were the machine. Cold, efficient, empty. I admitted. A tear tracked a hot, salty path through the grit on my cheek. But the machine broke in the snow. Suddenly a muffled pop echoed from far above. A faint, red glow began to seep down through the chimney of snow, the beacon. She had made it, but the red light was followed by something else. Voices, harsh, distorted by the wind. I see a signal. 50 yards north, go, go, go. It was Miller's voice, my head of security. A man who took pride in problem solving. If they see her... Elias gasped, struggling to rise and falling back with a groan of agony. They won't, I said, a sudden cold resolve hardening my chest. I reached out in the dark, fumbling for the laptop. I knew these systems. I had designed the architecture of Vance Global's mobile command units. I found the chassis. I felt for the emergency override switch on the side, a physical hardware kill switch meant for data breaches. Elias, if I trigger the internal battery's thermal runaway, it'll create a flare, a big one. It'll blow a hole in this pocket, but the heat signature will be so massive it'll blind their thermal goggles. It might even trigger a localized shift in the snow. It'll kill the air we have left, Elias warned. It'll give her a chance to be seen by the real search and rescue, I countered. The flares will be visible for miles. The Forest Service has a station on the North Ridge. They'll see it before Miller can get to her. Elias was silent for a long beat. Do it. I didn't hesitate. I jammed a metal pen into the battery vent and forced the override. The laptop began to hiss. A smell of ozone and ionized lithium filled the tiny space. Cover your eyes, I screamed. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was bright, a blinding, white-blue sun blooming in the center of our grave. The heat was instantaneous, searing the air. I felt the snow above us give way, not in a crush, but in a melt. For a split second I saw the sky, and then the world rushed in. The next few hours were a blurred montage of sensory overload, the roar of a heavy-lift helicopter, the blinding beam of a searchlight, the sound of shovels, real shovels, this time hitting the ice with frantic speed. We have a visual. 2 survivors. Get the thermal blankets. I remember being lifted. I remember the biting cold of the night air feeling like a kiss on my lungs. I remember seeing Miller and his team standing at the edge of the clearing, their black SUVs idling, their faces masked by shadows. They didn't move. They couldn't, not with 3 Forest Service Rangers and a Medivac crew surrounding the site. I stared at Miller as they loaded me onto the stretcher. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him until he looked away. And then I saw her. Lily was wrapped in a massive orange parka, sitting on the edge of a snowmobile. She was clutching a cup of cocoa, her eyes wide as she watched the paramedics work on her father. Daddy! She shrieked as they wheeled Elias past. He was unconscious, an oxygen mask strapped to his face, but his chest was moving. He was breathing. I felt a hand on my arm. It was the lead ranger. You're lucky, Miss Vance, that laptop flare. We saw it from 10 miles out. Any later, and the CO2 would have finished you. I looked at the charred, melted piece of plastic in his hand. $50 million. A billion-dollar company. A life of luxury. It had all come down to a piece of burning garbage. Is he going to make it? I asked, nodding toward Elias. The ranger looked grim. He's lost a lot of blood, and the infection in that shoulder is deep, but he's a fighter. He kept that girl warm for 3 days in a blizzard. Man like that doesn't quit easily. 2 months later. The glass walls of my office in Seattle usually made me feel powerful, like I was looking down on a world I had conquered. Today, they just felt cold. I pushed the resignation letter across the mahogany desk. The board of directors sat across from me, their faces a mixture of shock and suppressed fury. You can't be serious, Elena, the chairman said, his voice trembling. After the merger, after we successfully handled the Thorn litigation, the company is at an all-time high. The litigation was a lie, I said, my voice calm and low. And the merger was built on a foundation of stolen data. I've already turned over the Azure project's real logs to the Department of Justice. And the footage from the hidden pass security teams. The room went silent. I watched the blood drain from their faces. You've destroyed us, the CFO whispered. No, I stood up, grabbing my coat. I just stopped the machine. There's a difference. I walked out of the building for the last time. I didn't take the limo. I drove myself. The hospital was on the outskirts of the city, overlooking the water. It was quiet, peaceful. I walked down the hall to room 402. Lily was sitting on the floor, playing with a set of wooden blocks. She looked up and her face transformed into a beam of pure light. Elena! She ran to me, hugging my knees. She smelled like soap and strawberry shampoo. She was healthy. Her eyes were clear, the heaviness gone. The surgery in Zurich, the one the life-extending grant had paid for, had been a total success. Hey, princess, I whispered, ruffling her hair. How's your dad? He's awake. He's drawing. I looked at the bed. Elias was propped up on pillows. He looked thinner, his hair grayer, but the hollow, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet peace. He held a sketchbook in his lap. Elena, he said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. Elias? I sat in the chair beside his bed. For a long time, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. We were the only two people in the world who knew what it felt like to die in the dark and be reborn in the light. I heard about the board, he said, gesturing to the news on the small TV. You're giving it all up? I'm not giving it up, I said. I'm just changing my investments. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. I laid it on his lap. What's this? The deed to the cabin, I said. I bought the land, all 500 acres. And there's a contract inside. I'm starting a nonprofit. The Sarah Thorne Foundation. We're going to build a network of rural medical clinics places for families who fall through the cracks. People who the machines forget. Elias looked at the papers, then at me. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. I was going to kill you, Elena, he whispered, that night. If the snow hadn't come, I don't know if I would have let you go. I know, I said, reaching out to take his hand. His grip was warm now. But you didn't. You saved me. In more ways than one. Lily climbed up onto the bed between us, holding up a drawing. It was a picture of a mountain covered in white, but at the very top she had drawn a tiny, bright yellow sun. It's us, she said, pointing to 3 stick figures at the base of the sun. I looked at Elias, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with a heater or a fireplace. It was the warmth of being found. But as we sat there, a knock came at the door. 2 men in dark suits stood there, FBI. Miss Vance, Mr. Thorne, one of them said, his face grave. We've finished reviewing the encrypted files you recovered from the laptop. There's something you need to see. Something about your father, Elena, and why he really hired Elias 10 years ago. I felt the air in the room chill instantly. Elias and I exchanged a look of pure, sudden dread. My father is dead, I said. His secrets aren't, the agent replied. stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. He pulled out a tablet and swiped to a video file dated 15 years ago. On the screen, my father sat in his old office, looking younger, his eyes full of a fear I had never seen. He wasn't talking to a board member. He was talking to a man whose face was hidden in the shadows. "I found him," my father said on the recording. "The boy from the accident, Elias Thorne, he has the gift. He doesn't know who I am or what I did to his family, but I'm going to bring him in. I'm going to keep him close. It's the only way to make sure the truth never comes out." Part 4 cliffhanger. I felt the world tilt. I looked at Elias, whose hand had gone limp in mine. The man who had saved my life, the man whose life I had destroyed, wasn't just a random employee. He was a piece of a puzzle that started before I was even born. And as the agent hit play on the next clip, I realized the blizzard wasn't a coincidence, it was a reunion. And the dark secret Elias was hiding was nothing compared to the one I was about to uncover about my own blood.